The fog came in first, before the light did, rolling soft and grey off the water and settling into every seam of the harbour, like something that had always belonged there. It moved along the quays without hurry, wrapping around the hulls of anchored ships, softening the hard edges of capstans and coiled rope, until the whole waterfront seemed to exist in a kind of suspended breath. Somewhere beyond that grey curtain, the sun was beginning its slow climb, though it would be another hour before its light did more than pale the mist to the colour of old pewter. This was Portsmouth, or Plymouth, or perhaps the Nore. It hardly mattered which, for in these early years of the 1800s, England's naval ports had grown to resemble one another in their essential character, each a forest of masts rising from still water, each holding within its harbour waiting bulk of wooden walls that stood between an island nation and the ambitions of the wider world. The masts themselves were the first thing a traveller noticed, coming down from the hills above the harbour or along the coast road in the last dark hour before dawn. They rose in their hundreds, bare of canvas in these still moments, their yards crossed like the branches of a winter forest that had somehow taken root in salt water rather than soil. There was something almost skeletal about them in this light, pale, vertical lines against a sky not yet decided whether it would be blue or grey, spars catching what little illumination existed and holding it briefly before releasing it back into the mist. A person standing on the shore might have counted ships until the counting became meaningless, for the fleet at anchor here represented only a fraction of what the nation kept afloat in these years, when Britain's navy had grown to a size that no other power on earth could match. When perhaps 1,000 vessels of one class or another flew the white ensign or waited in ordinary for the call that would return them to active service. This was a navy at the height of its reach, though few who lived within its wooden walls would have described it in such grand terms. To the men who walk these decks, who climb these rigging lines in weather fair and foul, the fleet was not an abstraction of imperial power, but a daily reality of rope and canvas, of salt beef and ship's biscuit, of watches kept through the darkest hours, and orders followed without always understanding their larger purpose. The scale of the thing was almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. Thousands of guns, tens of thousands of men, a supply chain that stretched from the naval yards of England to outposts scattered across every ocean where British interests required a presence. And yet, each ship, each crew, each individual sailor experienced this vast machine only through the narrow compass of his own daily existence, the particular creak of his own vessel's timbers, the specific temperament of his own officers, no wider than the space between decks, and no larger than the men who shared his bread and his watches. It is this narrower view we mean to take up here, in this quiet chronicle, not the sweeping history of battles and admirals that fills so many grander accounts, but the smaller, slower story of what it meant to be an ordinary man swallowed into this extraordinary machine. We will not rush toward the thunder of guns, though that thunder will come in its proper time. We will not linger long on the names that history remembers best, for this is not primarily their story. Instead, we will walk the wet planking of the dockside in this grey hour before the world wakes, and we will follow, as patiently as the fog itself follows the contours of the harbour, the ordinary path of a man who might have been anyone, a farm boy from Yorkshire, a fisherman's son from Cornwall, a debtor fleeing the law, quote, or simply a young man with no better prospect than the sea offered. We will watch him become, slowly and by degrees, a sailor in Nelson's navy. The lanterns along the quay still burned at this hour, their light falling in soft yellow pools across cobblestones slicked with the night's damp and the harbour's perpetual moisture. These lights would be extinguished soon enough, once the true dawn arrived, but for now they held their small territories against the grey, illuminating the particular textures of a working waterfront in its last quiet moments before the day's business began. Here a coil of tarred rope thick as a man's arm, lay stacked beside a warehouse door, not yet unlocked. There a cart stood, abandoned between deliveries, its wheels still waiting for hands that had not yet arrived to guide it. The cobblestones themselves held the day's first impressions, not yet the countless footprints that would mark them by noon, but only the occasional passage of a night watchman, or a fisherman heading out before the fleet's own boats would crowd the water, or perhaps a press gang returning from some errand best not examined too closely. Their business concluded under cover of darkness. Gulls had already begun their morning conversations, though their numbers were still thin compared to what the full daylight would bring. Their cries carried strangely in the fog, seeming to come from every direction at once, and from no particular direction in especial, echoing off the hulls of the anchored ships and returning transformed, as though the harbour itself had learned to speak in the voice of seabirds. Occasionally, one would drop from some unseen perch atop a mast or rigging line, wheeling low over the water before rising again, its pale form briefly visible against the grey, before dissolving back into the general softness of the morning. These birds had witnessed countless such dawns, had watched fleets arrive and depart, had seen ships built and ships broken, and their indifference to the human dramas playing out beneath them was its own kind of commentary on the scale of things, the vast patience of the natural world set against the frantic, purposeful busyness that would soon transform this quiet harbour into something entirely different, for now, though the quiet held. It was the particular quiet of a working place between shifts, when the machinery of human industry has not yet been set back into motion but stands ready waiting, full of potential energy like a coiled spring. The ships themselves seemed to participate in this stillness, their timbers settled into the small movements of the tide, their rigging creaking occasionally with a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind itself, had there been wind enough to notice. This creaking was the voice of wood and rope adjusting to the water's gentle rise and fall, an ancient sound that had accompanied sailors since men first lashed timber together and trusted their lives to the sea's uncertain temper. In the pre-dawn stillness, this sound carried a particular resonance, as though the ships themselves were murmuring in their sleep, dreaming perhaps of the voyages behind them, or the voyages yet to come. Below decks, in the darkness that even dawn's approach could not yet penetrate, men slept in hammocks slung so close together that a sleeper's exhaled breath might warm the face of his neighbour. This was the ordinary intimacy of naval life, this proximity that civilian existence rarely required. Hundreds of men sharing air and space, and the particular smell of tar and bilgewater and unwashed wool that characterized every ship of the line. Soon enough, the ship's bell would mark the changing of the watch, and the rhythm of naval routine would assert itself once more, pulling men from whatever dreams occupied their brief rest and returning them to the endless cycle of duties that defined their existence. But for this moment, in this particular grey hour, even that machinery held its breath, waiting for the signal that would set it once more into motion. The harbour itself, viewed from the shore in this uncertain light, presented a study in patient waiting. Ships rode at anchor in ordered ranks, their positions determined by draft and purpose and the particular requirements of naval discipline that governed even where a vessel might rest. Were great ships of the line, their multiple gun decks suggesting the terrible power they carried within their wooden hulls, capable of delivering broadsides that could shatter an enemy vessel into so much floating wreckage. Others were smaller, frigates built for speed and scouting, sloops that carried messages and small cargoes between larger vessels and the shore, the countless auxiliary craft that any fleet required to function. Together they formed a small floating city, populated by thousands of men whose individual stories would mostly go unrecorded, whose names would appear, if at all, only in muster books and pay ledgers, the anonymous statistical record of a navy that required so many hands to accomplish its vast purposes. It is into this world that we mean to venture slowly and with patience, in the chronicle that follows. we will trace the path by which an ordinary man became a sailor. How he was found, how he was trained, how he learned the 1,000 small skills and disciplines that naval life demanded. We will follow him aboard into the wooden world that would become his entire universe for months or years at a stretch, a world with its own laws and rhythms, its own particular sufferings and occasional satisfactions. We will listen to the bells that marked his watches, taste something of the bread and salt beef and grog that sustained his body, understand something of the discipline that shaped his behavior and the punishments that awaited those who transgressed its codes. We will consider the sea itself in its many moods as both adversary and strange companion. We will sit with him in imagination at the surgeon's table when illness or injury required it, and we will stand beside him when the guns finally spoke in anger, when all the patient waiting resolved itself into the violence and confusion of battle. And we will follow him, too, into the aftermath, into whatever peace or grief or simple exhaustion followed such encounters, and eventually toward whatever landfall might return him, changed by his experience, to the ordinary world he had left behind. This is not a story that moves quickly, and it does not mean to. Like the fog that fills this harbor in the hour before dawn, we mean to settle in slowly, to let the details accumulate with the patience that the sea itself demands of those who would understand her. If you have come seeking a chronicle of ordinary lives caught up in extraordinary circumstances of what it meant, in the fullest and most human sense, to serve in Nelson's Navy, then perhaps this is a fitting place to begin. Settle in, if you will. The harbor is quiet still. The fog has not yet lifted. There is time enough before the day's work begins to understand something of what waits ahead for the men who will soon stir from their hammocks and take up once more the burden of their service. The gulls continue their calling. Somewhere in the mist, a ship's bell sounds once, marking time in a world that has not yet fully wakened. The lanterns still burn along the quay, their light growing gradually less necessary as the sky, ever so slowly, begins to pale toward morning. A man did not simply decide to become a sailor in those years, not in the way a man might decide to take up a trade or apprentice himself to a smith. The sea took what it needed, and it took in many different ways. And the muster book of any given ship, could it speak, would tell 100 different stories of arrival, no two of them quite alike, though many of them shared a common thread of necessity, or hunger, or the simple absence of any other path. Consider first the volunteers, for they existed, and their reasons were as varied as the men themselves. Some came from families that had sent fathers and grandfathers to sea before them, and for these boys, the ocean was less a mystery than an inheritance, a thing spoken of at hearths in villages along the coast, where the smell of tar and the sight of rigging were as familiar as the smell of bread or the sight of church spires. Such boys grew up watching ships pass on the horizon and dreaming, as boys will, of decks beneath their own feet, of distant harbors, of a life larger than the one their village offered. They came to the recruiting officers with something like eagerness, though eagerness tempered always by the quiet warnings of mothers and the harder silences of fathers who knew what waited. Others volunteered from poverty alone, and this was perhaps the larger number, if truth be told. In the towns and cities where work was scarce and wages thin, the king's service offered something that solid ground could not always guarantee. Food, however meager, and a wage however delayed, and a roof, however low and crowded and damp. A young man with no trade, no family land, no prospects beyond the docks, where he had perhaps loaded cargo or mended nets, might look upon the recruiting posters with their promises of prize money and adventure, and might convince himself that the sea offered more than the street. He was not always wrong. He was not always right either. But the choice, such as it was, belonged to him, and he carried it with him aboard, a small thing to hold on to, in the months that followed. Then there were the boys. And it is worth pausing here, for their stories carry a particular weight. Some were sent by families who could not feed them, placed aboard as servants to officers, or as members of the ship's boys, learning the trade of the sea before their voices had properly changed, before their bodies had grown into the labor demanded of them. A boy of 11 or 12 might find himself climbing rigging in a gale, might find himself standing watch in the cold hours before dawn, might find himself, in short, living a life that would break many grown men, and he did this because his family, in some cottage or tenement far from any harbour, had decided that the sea offered him better odds than the poorhouse, or the workhouse, or the slow starvation of a household with too many mouths and too little bread. It is not difficult to imagine the mixture of grief and hope that must have accompanied such decisions made by parents who loved their sons and could see no other way to save them. And then, threading through all of this, there was the press. And here, the story grows darker, though not, perhaps, in the way that later ages have sometimes imagined it. The press gang was a real thing and a feared thing, and it moved through the port towns like a kind of weather, unpredictable in its timing but entirely predictable in its eventual arrival. When the fleet needed men, and the fleet always needed men, for disease and desertion and the ordinary attrition of hard service left gaps that had to be filled, officers were sent ashore with parties of sailors, themselves often pressed men in earlier years, to gather up whatever bodies could be found and made to serve. The taverns were often the first target, for it was there that men gathered in the evenings, sailors between ships, labourers spending what little coin they had, young men of no particular occupation, drinking away an idle afternoon. A press gang might enter such a place without warning, and the room would fall into a particular kind of silence, a held breath, as men calculated their chances of slipping out a back door or through a window, or resigned themselves to the inevitable. Exemptions existed on paper, for certain trades and certain circumstances, but paper mattered little to a lieutenant who needed 20 men by morning, and had found only 12. A protestation of apprenticeship, a claim of family depending upon one's wages, a plea of illness or unfitness, these were sometimes heeded and sometimes not, depending on the desperation of the service and the temperament of the officer conducting the sweep. It was not only the taverns, though. The docks themselves were dangerous ground for a young man of the labouring classes, for the press gangs knew that able-bodied men congregated wherever ships loaded and unloaded their cargo, and a fellow hauling rope or carrying barrels might find himself, within the hour, carried instead toward a receiving ship anchored in the harbour. His old life ended as abruptly as a door closing. There are accounts, and they are not uncommon, of men taken while walking home from a day's honest work, taken while attending to some errand for their families, taken, in some cases, on their very wedding day. The ceremony scarcely concluded before the gang arrived and the groom was marched away toward a life he had not chosen and could not now refuse. The fear that followed young men along the docks in those years was a quiet fear, mostly, not the fear of immediate violence, though violence sometimes came, but the fear of sudden and irrevocable change, the fear of a hand upon one's shoulder that would alter, in an instant, the entire course of one's life. A young man walking near the water after dark might quicken his pace without quite admitting to himself why, might choose a longer route home to avoid a particular street where a press gang had been seen, might carry, always, some small document of exemption folded carefully in a pocket, though he knew, as all men knew, that such documents offered only uncertain protection. This fear was woven into the fabric of coastal life in ways that are difficult now to fully imagine, a low and constant hum beneath the ordinary business of living near the sea. And yet, even here, in the coercion and the fear, there is a complexity worth pausing over for many of the men taken by the press. Once aboard, once past the initial shock and grief of their capture, did not remain unwilling sailors forever. Some found, in the discipline and the community of shipboard life, a kind of purpose they had not known ashore. Some discovered a skill for the work, a steadiness aloft, a talent for gunnery or navigation that earned them respect and even advancement. This does not excuse the press, nor does it lessen the injustice done to those who were torn from their families and their choices, but it complicates the picture, as human stories so often complicate the simple narratives we might wish to tell about them. So the muster book of any ship, that long ledger of names and origins and rates of pay, was in truth a record of this entire spectrum of human circumstance. Ambition sitting beside desperation, volunteer beside pressed man, boy beside grown sailor, each name representing a different road that had led, eventually, to the same wooden deck, the same swinging hammock, the same uncertain horizon. A captain reading through his muster might see, if he looked closely enough, the whole of his nation's condition reflected there. The poverty of its cities, the desperation of its coastal villages, the ambition of its young men, the long reach of a war that required always more bodies than could be found by willing means alone. Once aboard, though, whatever road had brought a man to that point, he entered something entirely new, something that bore little resemblance to the life he had left behind on land. For the ship, once she had cleared the harbour and lost sight of shore, became a world entire unto herself, a floating village complete with all the structures and hierarchies and daily rhythms of any village ashore, save that this village could not be departed, could not be escaped, save at the ship's own convenience and the captain's own discretion. Every need that a man might have, food and shelter and companionship and labour, and even in some strange way a form of governance and law, existed within those wooden walls, sealed off entirely from the wider world. This was perhaps the deepest adjustment that any new sailor had to make, deeper even than the physical hardships of the work, deeper than the fear of the press that had brought some of them aboard. Slow understanding that the ship was now the whole of one's existence, that the horizon, however vast it appeared, marks the boundary of one's entire world for months or even years at a time, that the men around him, whatever their origins, whatever had brought them to this same deck, would now be his only society, his only family, his only witnesses to whatever life remained to him. The village ashore, with its familiar lanes and faces, its church bells and market days, receded behind him with the coastline itself, growing smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely beneath the curve of the sea, leaving him alone with several hundred other souls in a wooden world that answered to its own laws, its own rhythms, its own long and patient discipline. It is to that discipline, and to the daily texture of life within this floating village, that we might now, gently, turn our attention. The boat that carried him out to the ship was small and low in the water, crowded with sea chests and canvas bags and men who did not speak, and, as it drew nearer to the great vessel riding at anchor, the recruit found himself craning his neck upward at a wall of timber and rigging that seemed to rise without end, blotting out the grey morning sky. Up close, a ship of the line was less a vessel than a floating fortress, its sides thick with oak-grown dock and swollen from years of salt water, its masts rising higher than any structure he had seen ashore, higher than the church tower in his village, higher than anything he had imagined a thing built by human hands could rise. The smell reached him before he had even climbed the side. Tar and hemp and brine, the sourness of bilge water, the faint sweetness of rot beneath it all. A smell that would come in time to mean simply ship, to him. A smell he would carry in his memory long after he had left the sea behind. Waking sometimes in an ordinary bed, in an ordinary house, decades later, with that smell somehow present in the room, summoned by nothing he could name. He climbed the battens on the ship's side, with his heart beating hard against his ribs, gripping the man-ropes with hands that had not yet hardened into the leather they would become. And when he swung his legs over the gunwale and dropped down onto the deck, he found himself in a world utterly unlike anything the shore had prepared him for. The deck stretched away from him in both directions, longer than any room he had stood in, crowded with coiled rope and stacked shot, and men moving with a purpose he could not yet read, calling to one another in a language thick with terms he did not know: futtock and cathead, orlop and forecastle, larboard and starboard, words that would take him weeks to untangle and months to use without thinking. Overhead, the rigging rose in a vast dark lattice against the sky, lines running in every direction, seemingly without order to his untrained eye, though he would learn, eventually, that every rope had its purpose and its name, that nothing aboard a ship of this kind was arbitrary, that the entire structure was a machine of extraordinary complexity, built and maintained by men who had spent years learning to read it. The noise struck him almost as forcefully as the smell, the creak and groan of the ship's frame working against the sea, the slap of water against the hull, the cry of gulls overhead, the shouted orders of the officers, the tramp of bare feet on planking, the distant lowing of livestock penned somewhere forward. The clatter of a work party hauling something heavy across the deck. It was a noise that never fully stopped. He would learn, not even in the deepest part of the night, for a ship at sea was always working, always groaning and shifting and complaining against the water that bore it up. And a man learned to sleep through this ceaseless commotion, or he did not sleep at all. A petty officer took charge of him and the other new hands, herding them toward a hatchway near the ship's waist. And it was here that the recruit had his first descent into the world below decks, a world that would become, in truth, more familiar to him than the open air above. For it was below that he would eat and sleep and mess with his fellows for the whole of the commission ahead. The light changed first, the grey daylight of the upper deck giving way as he climbed down the ladder to a dimness lit only by a few lanterns swinging gently on their hooks, throwing shadows that moved with the ship's motion. The air changed too, growing closer and warmer, thick with the smell of tar and unwashed bodies and the lingering staleness of the bilge below, a smell that would take him days to stop noticing and that visitors from shore, he was told, could never quite get used to at all. The ship of the line on which he found himself rated was a floating world of several distinct levels, each with its own character and purpose, and he began, over the following days, to learn their names and their functions, as a child learns the rooms of a new house. Highest among the gun decks was the upper deck, open to sky and weather, where the ship was worked and sailed, where the officers walked their quarter-deck with an authority that seemed to the recruit almost supernatural, and where, in time of battle, the great guns of the upper tier would speak. Below this lay the main gun deck, dim even by day, lined on either side with the massive black shapes of cannon lashed fast against their ports, each gun attended by its own crew, each crew occupying in ordinary times the very space around the gun as their living quarters, for a warship wasted no space. And the men who would serve a gun in battle ate and slept beside it in peace, so that the weapon of war and the humble business of daily living existed aboard ship in the same few square feet of planking. Below the main gun deck lay another tier of guns, and below that, deeper still, the orlop deck, a space entirely without natural light, where the ship's stores were kept, where the cable tiers held the great anchor ropes coiled in vast serpentine loops, and where, in time of battle, the surgeon would set up his table to receive the wounded. A fact the recruit did not yet know, but would learn soon enough to dread. Deeper still lay the hold, the ship's very bottom, filled with the casks of water and salt provisions, and shot and powder that would sustain the vessel and her company for months at a time, ballasted low to keep her steady against the sea's constant pressure. It was a vertical village, he came to understand, layered like the floors of some strange tenement, each level opening onto the next by way of steep ladders and narrow hatchways through which men passed with a practiced ease that the recruit in his first days entirely lacked. Banging his head and barking his shins against beams that seemed to appear from nowhere in the gloom. It was on the main gun deck, or near it, that he was shown to his berth, not a room, not even truly a space of his own, but a numbered hook from which he would sling his hammock each night among perhaps a dozen or more other men, all crowded together in a space that seemed impossibly small for the number of bodies it must somehow contain. 14 inches, he was told, was the allotted width for each hammock, slung so close to its neighbors that a man's shoulder nearly touched the next man's on either side, and it seemed to him that first night an arrangement better suited to salted fish in a barrel than to human beings, though he would come, in time, to find a strange comfort in the closeness, in the warmth of so many bodies packed together against the damp chill that rose from below the waterline, in the gentle sway that rocked him, eventually, into a sleep deeper than any he had known ashore. Among the figures who moved through this wooden world, certain ones stood out to him from the first day, even before he learned their names or understood their functions. The captain he saw only rarely, and always at a distance, a solitary figure who walked his own portion of the quarterdeck without company, who ate alone in his great cabin at the stern, who seemed to the recruit less a man than a kind of distant weather system, whose moods, communicated through his lieutenants, could darken or brighten the atmosphere of the entire ship without his ever speaking a direct word to an ordinary seaman. This distance was not accident, but design, a deliberate separation maintained so that the captain's authority might remain absolute, untouched by the familiarity that could erode a lesser man's command. And the recruit understood, without being told in so many words, that he would likely serve the whole of his commission without ever exchanging a single sentence with the man whose word governed his fate entirely. Below the captain stood the lieutenants, younger men, often not much older than the recruit himself, who moved among the crew with a mixture of authority and youthful uncertainty that he found in some strange way more approachable than the captain's remote majesty. It was the lieutenants who relayed the day's orders, who stood watch through the long night hours, who would in time lead boarding parties and gun crews into whatever violence the voyage held in store. And beneath even the lieutenants, ruling the daily rhythm of shipboard life with an authority all his own, was the boatswain, whose silver whistle, the call, as it was known among the hands, could summon the entire crew to 100 different tasks with 100 different trilling patterns, each one memorized by ear long before a man could have named the task it summoned. All hands, up hammocks, away boats. The whistle's call, sharp and piercing even through the general noise of the ship, became, within his first week aboard, the true governing voice of his days, more immediate and more constantly present than any spoken order. A sound that would wake him from the soundest sleep and send him stumbling toward his station before he was even fully conscious of having heard it. That first night, swinging in his hammock among strangers, whose names he did not yet know, the recruit lay awake for a long while listening to the ship's strange symphony of creaks and groans, feeling the gentle rise and fall of the swell beneath him, the cold seeping faintly upward from the bilge below, the warmth of the man sleeping close beside him. Above him, through the deck planking, he could hear the tread of the watch on duty, the occasional call between one lookout and another, the distant slap of water against the hull that never, not for one moment of the whole night, entirely ceased. Thought, before sleep finally took him, of the harbour he had left that morning, already impossibly distant, and of the strange new family of hammocks and whistles and dim lantern light into which he had been so suddenly delivered, a wooden world, self-contained and self-governing, and into whose rhythms he now understood he must learn to disappear. That rhythm, once he began to learn it, revealed itself as the true architecture of the ship, more binding than any timber, more constant than any officer's command. The day at sea was not measured in hours as a man ashore might reckon them, sunrise to sunset, morning to evening, but in watches, 4 hours apiece, each one a small vessel of time set afloat within the larger voyage. The bell marked their passing, struck in pairs, rising through the watch until 8 bells brought its natural end, and the ship's company turned over like a great slow wheel, one half rising from sleep as the other half sank gratefully toward it. He had not understood that first morning how completely this cycle would consume him, how thoroughly it would replace the ordinary sense of day and night he had carried from his life ashore. Now there was only the watch he stood and the watch he was owed, the 4 hours of labor and the 4 hours, or sometimes less, of uncertain rest. The first light of each day found the ship already stirring, for the sea granted no true stillness, no hour in which the vessel simply rested upon the water without tending. Decks were washed before the sun had properly cleared the horizon, holly stones dragged across worn planking by men on their knees, the stone rasping back and forth in a sound that became in time as familiar and unremarked as breathing. The salt water was hauled up in buckets and slopped across the boards, and the men worked, bent-backed in the grey light, their trousers rolled, their bare feet numb against the wet wood, saying little, for there was little to say about a task that would be repeated tomorrow exactly as it had been performed today. He learned to recognize the particular ache that settled into the knees and lower back after an hour of this scrubbing, an ache that never entirely departed, but simply diminished into the general catalogue of small pains that made up a sailor's waking hours. Beyond the washing of decks, there stretched an endless inventory of labor, each task modest in itself, but ceaseless in its accumulation. Lines needed hauling, braces, halyards, sheets, the countless ropes that governed the ship's great cloth wings, each one leading to a block, each block to a purpose the newer hands were still learning to read. He came to know the particular burn of rope through unpracticed hands, the way the fibers left their mark on his palms until calluses formed, thick and yellow, that no longer registered the friction as pain. Sails required mending, canvas torn by wind or salt rot stitched back together with needle and palm, the older hands working with an unhurried precision that the newer sailors watched and tried, clumsily at first, to imitate. Rigging was tarred to protect it from the weather's slow erosion, a black and pungent labor that left men's hands and forearms stained for days afterward, the smell of it settling into clothing that never quite lost the scent. There was brass to polish, though the ship carried little enough of it to justify the ritual beyond the officer's evident belief that idle hands invited idle minds. There was the endless business of oakum, old rope picked apart, strand by strand into loose fiber that would be driven into the seams, between planks, to keep the sea where the sea belonged, outside the hull rather than within it. Men sat at this task for hours at a stretch, their fingers moving with a mechanical patience, the pile of unraveled fiber growing slowly at their feet, while conversation, when it came at all, drifted in low murmurs that seemed to match the unhurried rhythm of the work itself. He found in time that his own hands had begun to move, without instruction from his mind, that the labor had settled into muscle and bone in a way that freed his thoughts to wander even as his fingers continued their small, repeated motions. Beneath all of this labor, beneath the discipline that governed it and the officers who oversaw it, there lay a fatigue that the ship's routines did not acknowledge and could not accommodate. 4 hours of watch, 4 hours of uncertain rest, and always the possibility that rest would be cut short by a call to shorten sail, by a sudden squall, by the boatswain's whistle summoning all hands for some task that could not wait for the natural turning of the watch. Men slept, when they slept, in snatched portions, their hammocks slung so close together that a man's elbow might brush his neighbor's shoulder with each roll of the ship, the air below decks thick with the breath and warmth of 200 bodies pressed into a space that had never been designed for comfort. He learned to sleep despite the closeness, despite the creak of the hull and the constant motion, because exhaustion, in the end, proved a more persuasive force than discomfort. He learned also that this exhaustion never entirely lifted, that it settled into a man over weeks and months at sea, a weight carried in the same quiet way that the ship carried her ballast, unseen but always present, shaping the way a man moved, and the shortness of his temper, and the heaviness of his eyes, even in the brightest hour of the afternoon watch. The monotony beneath the discipline was a thing rarely spoken of, for what use was there in speaking of what could not be altered? The same tasks recurred with the same regularity as the bells that announced them, the same decks to scrub, the same lines to haul, the same sails to mend, the same rigging to tar, day following day in a sequence that blurred, after enough repetition, into something almost indistinguishable from itself. A man might find himself uncertain on any given afternoon, whether it was the 4th day since landfall or the 5th, whether this watch's labour was truly different from the last, or merely felt so because his body ached in a marginally different place. The ship's discipline, so rigid in its outward form, concealed within it this deeper sameness, this slow erosion of distinction between one day and the next, that no bell, however precisely struck, could entirely dispel. He came to understand that this too was a kind of weight the sea imposed, not the weight of danger, which came rarely and departed quickly, but the weight of repetition, patient and unspectacular, wearing at a man's sense of time the way water wears at stone. And yet within this monotony, within the ceaseless small labours and the exhaustion that never fully lifted, there existed also a companionship that the newer sailors had not expected to find, that the older hands seemed to carry as a kind of quiet inheritance. Men working aligned together fell without conscious decision into rhythms of shared effort, a call and response of grunts and murmured counts that coordinated the pull of many hands into a single motion more effective than any one man's strength alone. In this shared labour, there grew a low current of fellowship, unspoken for the most part, expressed less in words than in the simple fact of proximity endured together, day after day, watch after watch. A man learned the particular way his neighbour coiled a rope, the small habits of another's hands at the oakum pile, the particular rasp of a third man's holystone against the deck. And these small recognitions accumulated into something that resembled, if not friendship exactly, then a kind of familiarity that eased the weight of the labour without lightening the labour itself. Sometimes, over the slow work of picking oakum or the steady rhythm of tarring rigging, a man would begin to hum, softly, almost without meaning to, some half-remembered tune from a life ashore that seemed, in this setting, both foreign and comforting. Others would take it up, not in unison exactly, for few could recall all the words, but in a kind of loose accompaniment, voices low and unhurried, matching the pace of the work rather than any particular melody. These songs were rarely sung in full, rarely performed as entertainment might be performed. They existed instead as a kind of murmured backdrop to labour, rising and falling with the rhythm of hands at rope or needle, fading into silence when the officer of the watch drew near, and resuming softly once he had passed. He found himself, in time, humming along with tunes he did not know he had learned, his voice joining the low current of sound that moved along the deck like something half-conscious, a shared breath rather than a performance. It was in these moments, the low hum over ropework, the shared glance exchanged when a particularly heavy line came free at last, the wordless nod that passed between men finishing a task together, that the ship's rigid architecture of bells and watches revealed its softer underside. The discipline that governed every hour did not, it seemed, entirely extinguish the human warmth that gathered in the spaces between its demands. Men found companionship not in leisure, for leisure was scarce and closely rationed, but in labour itself, in the shared endurance of monotony and exhaustion that no rank could entirely separate one man from another. He came to understand, as the days passed into weeks, that this was perhaps the ship's quiet lesson, that the wooden world into which he had been delivered asked everything of a man's body and much of his patience, but offered in return this thin thread of fellowship woven through the endless repetition of the watch. sustaining him through hours that might otherwise have worn him down to nothing at all. It was in the matter of food that this fellowship found its plainest expression. For whatever else divided the men of a ship, their rank, their origins, the accidents of birth that had placed one behind an officer's writing desk and another before a gun, all shared in the end the same hard bread and the same grey meat drawn from the same barrels. And there was a kind of levelling honesty in that shared want, which no sermon on brotherhood could have taught so plainly. The biscuit, that hard-travelling bread, the sailors called hardtack, was baked months or sometimes years before it reached a man's hand, baked hard enough to survive a voyage round the world, if need be, and it arrived aboard ship already old, already beginning its slow surrender to time and damp, and the small creatures that seemed to find it before any sailor did. A man learned quickly to tap his biscuit against the table before eating. A soft percussion repeated at every mess across the ship, meant to dislodge the weevils that had made their homes within, and if he was still hungry enough, and he generally was, he ate around them, or ate through them. For there was no replacing what had been eaten, and no sense in wasting what remained. Some men joked, in the dry way of sailors who have long since stopped being surprised by anything, that the weevils had more claim to the biscuit than the men did, having lived there longer, and there was laughter in this. The particular laughter of those who have made peace with a small horror by naming it and living alongside it rather than fighting it any longer. The salted meat came in barrels marked with dates that meant less with each passing month at sea, beef or pork packed in brine until it had taken on the color and something of the texture of the wood that housed it, and a man, soaking his portion in the ship's fresh water before boiling it, might still find it tough as rope, grey at the edges, tasting more of salt and barrel than of any animal that had once grazed beneath open sky. There was an old joke among sailors, repeated so often it had ceased to be funny, and become instead a kind of ritual complaint, that the meat could be carved into buttons or beads, so hard had the salt and thyme made it, and men would sometimes do just this in idle moments, whittling a piece of gristle into some small trinket to send home or trade with a shipmate, a strange handicraft born of necessity and boredom both. And yet a man ate it gladly on the days when hunger pressed harder than distaste. For the body at sea burned through what it was given at a rate that made a man's appetite something closer to an animal need than any civilized preference. There was little room aboard ship. Then there was the grog, the daily ration of rum, cut with water, doled out at fixed hours, with a ceremony that never varied and was never skipped. For if the biscuit and the meat sustained the body, the grog sustained something else entirely, the temper, the patience, the thin margin between a man's endurance and his breaking point. It came twice a day in most ships, morning and evening, poured by the steward under an officer's watch so that no man might claim more than his due, and a sailor came to measure the hours of his day by its arrival, almost as much as by the ship's bells, the promise of it waiting at the far end of a watch like a small warm light at the end of a cold corridor. It softened the hours, there was no other honest way to say it. It took the edge from the cold, blurred the sharper corners of exhaustion, made the endless grey monotony of the sea bearable in a way that duty alone could not always manage. And if a man drank it too eagerly, too often, and paid for it later, in dullness of hand and mind. This was a private reckoning each sailor made for himself, weighed against the plain fact that the ration was one of the few things aboard ship that belonged wholly to him, that no rule of the King's Navy could take back once it was poured. The galley itself sat low in the ship's belly, a modest brick hearth built to withstand the roll of the sea, tended by a cook who was very often himself a man, broken in body by some earlier service, missing a leg perhaps or an arm. For the position of ship's cook was one of the few berths the Navy kept aside, for men no longer fit for the more demanding labours of the deck, and there was a quiet mercy in this arrangement that went largely unremarked upon, a recognition, however unspoken, that a man who had given something of himself to the service might still find a place aboard, still find use, still find a way to be needed. The cook worked in cramped quarters thick with smoke and the smell of boiling meat, his fire carefully banked and watched. For an unguarded flame aboard a wooden ship was a danger graver than any enemy sail on the horizon. And he moved through his work with the particular economy of a man who had learned to manage a difficult task with limited means and no complaint, for complaint changed nothing about the size of the pot or the toughness of the meat within it. And when the meal came at last, ladled into the wooden kids the mess groups shared, there was, despite everything, despite the salt and the toughness and the weevils that no diligence could entirely banish, a genuine and simple comfort in it, especially on the colder days when the wind cut through oilskins and a man's hands had gone stiff and clumsy at the ropes. A hot meal, however plain, however repetitive, however far from anything a man might have chosen if choice had been given him, was still heat taken into the body on a cold sea, still something to look forward to across the long stretch of a watch, still a moment when a man might sit with his messmates in the low glow of a lantern and feel, for the space of that meal, something like ease. There was talk at these times, low and unhurried, the kind of talk that filled the gaps between labor without demanding much of a tired man, talk of home, of past ships, of small grievances and smaller jokes, the ordinary conversation of men bound together by circumstance who had learned, out of necessity, to make something like companionship out of what they had been given. But beneath this rough comfort ran a darker thread, one that the sailors of that age could feel in their own failing bodies long before they understood its cause. Scurvy moved through ships on long voyages like a slow, patient tide, beginning quietly. A certain heaviness in the limbs, gums that bled at the smallest pressure, bruises that appeared without cause and lingered without healing before deepening into something crueler, teeth loosening in swollen gums. Old wounds reopening, as though the body itself were unraveling backward through its own history of injuries. Men grew listless, their strength draining away by degrees so gradual that it was sometimes mistaken for ordinary fatigue until it had progressed too far to easily correct. And there were ships, in the earlier days of long ocean crossings, that lost more hands to this slow wasting than to any storm or any enemy engagement. The cause was not yet understood in any settled way for much of this era. Theories were proposed and discarded, remedies tried and found wanting, and it would take the patient observations of men like Lind, testing his careful comparisons of oranges and lemons against vinegar and seawater, to begin drawing out the truth that had eluded so many for so long, that something in fresh fruit, some property not yet named, held the answer that salted meat and hard biscuit could never provide. By the later years of Nelson's service, citrus juice had become a more regular part of naval provisioning, a small vial of prevention finally recognized for what it was, though the knowledge had come only after generations of sailors had already paid the cost of its absence, their names recorded in ship's logs beside causes of death that read, with a plainness that still carries its own quiet weight across the centuries, simply as scurvy, or as a wasting of unknown origin. And so a man came to understand, if he served long enough, that the food he ate, however plain, however maligned in the grumbling talk of the mess deck, was not merely fuel for labor, but something closer to the ship's own quiet form of care, imperfect and incomplete as that care so often was. A full ration, however coarse, meant a crew with strength enough to work the sails through a long night, a diminished one through shortage or spoilage, or the simple bad luck of a delayed resupply, meant tempers grown thin and bodies grown slow, and there was no captain, however skilled in matters of strategy or seamanship, who could entirely compensate for a hungry crew's fading will. It was food, more than any flag or any promise of prize money, that shaped the daily temper of a ship's company. The arrival of fresh bread after weeks of hardtack could lift a crew's spirits more surely than news of victory elsewhere, and the sudden scarcity of grog whatever its cause. Could sour 100 men's tempers faster than any hardship of weather. Glory, when it came rarely and briefly, a single sharp hour amid months of grey monotony. But bread came daily, or was meant to, and grog came twice each day without fail, and it was this steady, humble rhythm, bread, salt, and grog, moth, poured, and portioned and endured together, that held a crew's spirit together far more reliably than any distant promise of honor ever could. A lesson the ship's authorities came, slowly and imperfectly, to understand, long before the language of nutrition had caught up to what the sailors' own failing bodies had already been trying, patiently. To tell them, a ship, for all her rigging and her guns, was in the end a small wooden village afloat on an indifferent sea, and like any village, she required an order that held her together when the wind did not. Yet that order was hierarchy, and it ran through every plank and rope of her, from the captain in his stern cabin down to the ship's boys who slept wherever a hammock might be slung. A sailor learned this order before he learned much else. He learned it in the particular silence that fell when an officer passed along the deck, in the way men touched their caps without being told to, in the small automatic deference that became, after enough weeks at sea, indistinguishable from instinct. Respect and fear lived very close together aboard a man of war, so close that a sailor himself might have struggled to say, on any given day, which one moved him to obey a command instantly and without question. Perhaps it did not matter. The ship required obedience the way she required caulking and cordage, and whether that obedience came from admiration or from dread, it held the vessel together all the same. The captain stood at the summit of this small world, and his word was in the most literal sense the law allowed. Absolute. At sea, beyond the reach of any magistrate or court, he was judge and enforcer both, answerable in theory to the Admiralty and to God, but answerable in practice to no one within 1,000 miles of salt water. This was not an arrangement designed for cruelty, though cruelty found ample room within it. It was simply the only arrangement that could function, given the isolation of a ship and the constant real possibility of mutiny, desertion, or collapse. A crew of several hundred men, drawn from press gangs and prisons and quiet fishing villages alike, could not be governed by gentle suggestion. The rules were written down, and periodically, usually on a Sunday, after the reading of scripture, the ship's company was assembled on deck to hear them again. The articles of war read aloud in a flat, official voice by the captain or his clerk, each article ending in the same grim refrain: "Shall suffer death," or such other punishment as a court-martial shall think fit. Men stood in their ranks and listened to this recitation, not with fresh alarm, but with the dull familiarity of men hearing a sermon they had heard many times before. Yet the familiarity did not entirely dull the weight of the words. Every sailor aboard knew that the articles were not decoration. They had seen, or would see, what happened when they were invoked. Punishment, when it came publicly, and it came with a kind of terrible order that made it somehow more unsettling than chaos would have been. Flogging was the most common instrument of naval discipline, and it was administered with a ceremony that seems, from the distance of centuries, almost unbearably formal for an act of such violence. The whole crew was piped to witness punishment, called up from below and arranged along the deck and in the rigging so that the lesson might be seen by every man aboard. The boatswain's mates prepared the cat-o'-nine-tails, drawing it from a red baize bag kept for the purpose, and the offender was stripped to the waist and bound to a grating rigged upright for the occasion. The drum, if there was a drum, gave a slow roll. The captain read the offence and a sentence. And then the lashes were laid on, one at a time, counted aloud, the rhythm of the strokes as measured and deliberate as anything else in the ship's routine. A dozen lashes was common for a minor infraction. 2 or 3 dozen was not unusual for something graver. and in the worst cases, sentences reaching 100 lashes or more were carried out not in one sitting, but spread across several days, so that the man's back might heal enough between floggings to survive the next installment. The surgeons stood by during these punishments, not to intervene, but to certify that the man could endure what remained of his sentence. Sailors watched these episodes in silence, and it was a silence that did more to enforce discipline, perhaps, than the flogging itself. The sight of a shipmate's back opened to the bone, the smell of it, the low grunt or held breath of a man determined not to cry out before his own crew. Lesser offences drew lesser punishments. Confinement in irons below decks, a reduction in rations, a spell in the bilboes, a public dowsing from the yardarm, the humiliating spectacle of running the gauntlet through 2 lines of one's own shipmates armed with knotted rope, desertion, striking an officer, sleeping at one's post during watch, theft from a shipmate, each carried its own accepted tariff of pain, understood by every man aboard almost as thoroughly as he understood the ship's rigging plan. And beyond these lay the ultimate sanction, hanging, reserved for mutiny or its equivalent, carried out from the yardarm before the assembled fleet if the offence seemed to warrant such an audience. A spectacle meant less for the condemned man than for every sailor who would afterward remember precisely what mutiny cost. Yet it would be a mistake, and an ungenerous one, to think of naval discipline as nothing but the cat and the noose. The system produced cruelty in abundance, but it did not produce cruelty uniformly, and the difference between a well-run ship and a wretched one often came down to nothing more than the character of the man who commanded her. Some captains ruled by terror alone, flogging liberally for offences that other commanders would have dismissed with a reprimand, treating their crews as a resource to be exhausted rather than men to be led. Such captains were feared, certainly, but they were rarely loved, and their ships, though outwardly obedient, often carried within them a current of resentment that surfaced, eventually, in desertion rates, in sullen work, in the quiet, unspoken withholding of any effort beyond the strictly required. Other captains understood, whether through native decency or through hard experience, that a crew given fair treatment, reasonable rations and consistent justice would work harder, fight better, and desert less than a crew driven purely by dread. These were the captains whose names sailors spoke of afterward, in taverns and in old age, with something approaching genuine affection, men who flogged only when flogging was unavoidable, who knew their crews by name and by history, who shared, so far as rank permitted, in the discomforts their men endured. It is in the log and letters of such a man that the texture of this divided world becomes most vivid. Captain James Gordon of His Majesty's frigate Active kept, as most commanders did, a log of daily events aboard his ship. But Gordon's entries, along with the private correspondence he left behind, reveal a mind unusually attentive to the balance between severity and fairness that command required. In one letter written to a fellow officer, he confided that a captain who rules only by the lash will find, in time of true danger, that his men serve him with their bodies but withhold their hearts, and it is the heart of a crew, more than their obedience, that carries a ship through the extremity of battle. Gordon's own log records punishments. He was no reformer, and the articles of war applied on his ship as they did on any other. But the entries are notably sparser than those of many of his contemporaries, and where he did order a flogging, his notes often include some brief explanation of the offence, as though he felt some obligation to justify the severity even to his own private record. On one occasion, he wrote simply, "Punished Wem Carter, 2 dose lashes. Drunkenness on watch, 2nd offence. Warned the crew this would not be tolerated a 3rd time from any man among them, myself included in the warning, were I ever to fail my own duty." That last clause, a captain including himself, however rhetorically, within the reach of the ship's discipline, was rare enough to be remarkable, and it is easy to imagine the effect such a statement might have had on men who had served under commanders who considered themselves exempt from every rule they enforced on others. This, perhaps, is the quiet truth that lay beneath the whole architecture of naval discipline. That fear could compel a crew to obey, but only fairness, consistently applied, could compel them to endure. A ship was too small, too enclosed, too utterly dependent on cooperation for cruelty alone to sustain her through the long trials of a commission, the storms, the blockades, the months of empty horizon, and when it came, the smoke and thunder of an enemy broadside. The captains who understood this, who tempered the articles of war with something like justice, built beneath them not merely obedient crews but loyal ones, men who would work the pumps through a gale without being ordered, who would stand to their guns without needing the boatswain's rope at their backs. The captains who did not understand this built ships that functioned, for a time, on dread alone, until dread wore thin, as it always eventually did, against the greater and more permanent fact of the sea itself. Patient, indifferent, and entirely unconcerned, temporary kingdom of his ship, for beneath every order given, every punishment weighed, every ration measured out with careful hands, there lay the sea itself, and the sea did not concern itself with the affairs of men. It had been there before the ship was timbered into being, before the captain had earned his commission, before the youngest boy aboard had drawn his first breath in some grey coastal town, and it would remain long after all of them had gone to whatever rest awaited sailors. The ocean was not cruel, though it could seem so, and it was not kind, though it could seem that too. It simply was vast and moving and indifferent, and every man who signed his name or made his mark to serve upon it understood, in some quiet chamber of himself, that he had agreed to live upon the surface of something that did not know he existed. This was the fact beneath all other facts of naval life. The discipline, the rhythm of the watch, the small comforts of bread and grog, the fear of the lash, or the hope of prize money, all of it was arranged atop a foundation of water that could shift in an hour from glassy calm to a fury no human order could command. Sailors spoke of the sea the way men speak of a great relation, one both trusted and feared, addressed with familiarity but never taken for granted. They gave it moods. They gave it intentions it did not possess, because it was easier to imagine a bargain with a temperamental god than to accept the plainer truth, which was that the water rose and fell according to forces no prayer could turn aside. A storm did not arrive all at once. This was among the first lessons a sailor learned, whether he had been pressed from a merchant vessel or grown up watching the tides from some rocky shore. The sea gave warning, though the warning was subtle, written in a language that had to be learned slowly through years of paying close attention to small things. The wind would shift its quarter and carry with it a smell some described as metal, others as green, a scent that seemed to rise from the water itself rather than from any cloud. The swell would lengthen before the wind had grown at all, long, slow ridges of water rolling in from some distant disturbance that the ship's barometer, if she carried one, might not yet register as significant. Old sailors watched the horizon with a patience that younger men mistook for idleness, and it was often an older sailor, some weathered quartermaster or boatswain's mate, who first murmured that the glass was falling or that the sky to windward had taken on a look he did not care for. The clouds themselves were read like a kind of scripture. A high, thin veil, pale and fibrous, might mean nothing at all, or it might mean that weather was building far off, invisible yet, but already in motion. A mackerel sky, dappled and orderly, was said among sailors to mean a change was coming within a day. And, though there was no instrument to confirm this, beyond the accumulated memory of thousands of voyages, the pattern held often enough. A ring around the moon was watched with quiet unease. The color of the sunset was noted and discussed in low voices at the change of the watch, a red sky at evening taken as a hopeful sign, a red sky at morning regarded with suspicion. And whether these sayings held any real meteorological truth mattered less than the discipline of attention they instilled. A sailor who watched the sky and sea as carefully as scripture was a sailor less likely to be caught unprepared. The ship herself gave warnings too, if a man knew how to listen. The timbers spoke a language of creaks and groans that varied with the sea state, and an experienced hand could distinguish the ordinary complaint of a hull working gently in a moderate swell from the tighter, more urgent sound of wood under greater strain. The rigging hummed differently as the wind increased, each rope and stay finding its own particular note, until the whole apparatus of masts and cordage became a kind of instrument playing a steadily rising and more ominous tune. Men who had spent years aboard could often tell, with eyes closed, roughly how hard the wind was blowing, and from which direction, simply by attending to the voice of the ship around them. Sex, the B-tection. When the signs accumulated past a certain point, the order would come to shorten sail, and this was done not in panic, but with the practiced calm that came from having performed the maneuver 100 times before, under 100 different skies. The captain, standing near the wheel or pacing the quarterdeck with his hands clasped behind him, would give his orders in the same measured tone he used for ordinary sailing, because a captain who allowed his voice to rise with the wind taught his men to fear him more than they feared the sea, and fear directed at the wrong object served no one. The best captains understood that calm was itself a kind of seamanship, that the crew took its emotional temperature from the quarterdeck, and that an even voice giving clear orders could steady 200 men against a darkening sky more effectively than any speech about courage. The topmen went aloft as the wind rose out along yards that swayed with increasing violence, their bare feet finding the footropes by memory as much as sight, their hands working canvas that fought against them like something alive. This work did not stop because the weather worsened. If anything, it became more urgent, for a ship caught with too much sail in a rising gale could be dismasted, or worse, driven onto a lee shore where no seamanship could save her. The men aloft did not have the luxury of terror, or rather they set their terror aside as a matter of professional necessity, focusing instead on the coarse texture of wet canvas beneath their palms, the particular knot required, the exact sequence of movements that would bring the sail under control before the wind tore it, or them, away. Below, the ship's motion changed character entirely as the storm built. What had been a gentle roll became a violent pitching and rolling combined, the deck tilting first one direction and then another in patterns that seemed almost designed to defeat a man's sense of balance. Loose items not properly secured became small missiles, sliding and crashing with each surge. Water began to find its way below, through hatches and seams that had been dry for weeks, and the pumps, which in calm weather might be worked for only an hour or two each day as routine maintenance, now demanded constant attention, watch after watch, men taking their turns at the handles until their arms burned and their hands blistered. Working, not from fear of punishment, but from the plainer understanding that a ship allowed to fill with water was a ship that would eventually stop floating. The sound of a storm at full strength was described by those who survived, many of them, as something that filled the entire world, leaving no space for any other sensation. The wind screamed through what rigging remained, a sound with no clear source, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The waves themselves produced a deep percussive violence as they struck the hull, sometimes breaking clean over the deck and sending solid water rushing along the planking with enough force to sweep a man from his feet if he had not lashed himself to something solid. Thunder, when it came, seemed almost an afterthought against the more immediate violence of wind and water, though the lightning that accompanied it briefly illuminated a scene that most men were, in that moment, glad not to see too clearly. And yet, remarkably, the crew's practiced calm persisted even here. Men shouted orders and acknowledgements to be heard over the wind, but the content of what they shouted remained procedural, technical, the same words used in 100 previous storms. There was little room aboard a fighting ship for displays of terror, not because sailors did not feel fear, but because the tasks required of them left no time to indulge it. A man hauling on a line in a gale thought about the line, about his footing, about the man beside him whose safety depended partly on his own steadiness. Fear, when it came, arrived later, in quieter moments, remembered rather than experienced, turned over in a hammock during some calmer watch weeks afterward. What sustained men through such trials was not merely discipline imposed from above, but a kind of hard-won intimacy with the sea itself, built through years of exposure until the ocean's violence, while never welcomed, became at least familiar. A sailor who had weathered a dozen gales approached the 13th with a steadiness that a landsman could never have summoned, not because he had grown less afraid, but because he had learned what fear could be set aside and what attention could not. This was perhaps the deepest education the Navy offered. Deeper than gunnery or navigation, an education in how a human being might continue to function amid conditions that seemed, by any reasonable measure, to exceed what flesh and mind were built to endure. The storm would pass, as storms always eventually did, leaving behind a sea that seemed almost apologetic in its sudden calm, long swells rolling gently beneath a sky washed clean of cloud. The ship, battered and often damaged in her rigging or her sails, would be assessed and repaired with the same patient competence that had carried her through the worst of the weather. And the sailors, exhausted, would return to the ordinary rhythms of watch and duty. The sea once more a companion rather than an antagonist, though every man aboard understood, in the quiet way that sailors understood most things about their trade, that this peace was temporary, that the water beneath them remained exactly as indifferent as it had been during the worst hour of the gale, waiting without malice or intention for whatever weather might come next. Below the waterline, past the orlop, where the cables coiled like sleeping serpents and the air hung thick with bilge water and tar, there was a space no larger than a modest cabin where a different kind of battle was fought, quietly and without glory, almost every day that the ship remained at sea. The surgeon's berth, as it was called, occupied one of the darkest and most cramped quarters of the vessel, chosen not for convenience but for safety, tucked below the waterline where enemy shot could not easily reach it, where the wounded might be carried during battle without passing through the chaos above. It was lit by lanterns that swung with the roll of the ship, casting shadows that moved independent of the men who cast them, and it smelled of vinegar and blood and the tallow used to seal wounds, a smell that never fully left the space no matter how often it was scrubbed. The surgeon who worked in this space was in the era of Nelson's Navy a figure of uncertain standing, respected for his knowledge, distrusted for the crudeness of his methods, essential to every soul aboard, and yet paid little more than a common seaman for his trouble. He was rarely a physician in the modern sense, rarely a man of extensive formal training, though some were remarkably skilled, having apprenticed for years before ever setting foot on a king's ship. His instruments, laid out on a rolled cloth or kept in a wooden case, were simple by any later standard. Knives for cutting, saws for amputation, needles and thread for closing wounds, a tourniquet fashioned from leather and rope, and bottles of laudanum or rum that served as the only mercy available against pain that modern medicine would later refuse to allow a patient to endure unmedicated. There was no anesthesia beyond the bottle and the belief that a strong drink and a stronger will might carry a man through what was coming. There was no understanding of infection as caused by anything smaller than bad air or ill humors, and so wounds were cleaned as best the surgeon knew, with wine or vinegar or simply left to the body's own uncertain mercy. And many men who survived the initial injury succumbed in the days after to a fever that no one aboard could name, only watch, helpless, as it took hold and would not release. To face the surgeon's table required a particular kind of courage, different from the courage demanded by storm or battle. because it asked a man to submit willingly to pain he could see coming, administered by another man's hand, with no promise of success beyond the surgeon's steady grip and years of grim experience. A sailor with a shattered arm, crushed beneath a falling spar or torn by a fall from the rigging, knew before he was carried below what awaited him if the injury proved too severe to save. The sore was not hidden from him. He would hear it before he felt it, would see it laid upon the cloth beside the knives, would understand, in the moments before the surgeon began, exactly what was about to happen to his body. And still he was expected to hold still, to bite down on the leather strap or the rolled cloth provided for that purpose, to endure without flinching, so far as his flesh allowed, because the ship could not stop for his suffering and the surgeon could not work if the patient thrashed against the blade. Men were held down by their shipmates during these procedures, strong hands pressing shoulders and legs against the table, not out of cruelty but necessity. And it was said that the worst sound aboard any ship of the line was not the crash of enemy broadside, but the particular quality of a man's voice during an amputation, a sound that settled into the memory of everyone who heard it and never entirely left beyond the violence of injury. Illness moved through the ship in slower, quieter ways, no less deadly for their patients. Fever was the most feared of these visitors, arriving without warning in tropical waters or crowded harbors, spreading through the confined spaces below deck where hundreds of men breathed the same close air and slept inches from one another in hammocks slung so tight that a man's shoulder often touched his neighbor's through the canvas. Yellow fever, malaria, typhus. The sailors did not always know which visited them, only that a shipmate healthy at breakfast might be shivering and delirious by evening, and that within days he might be gone, his body wrapped and committed to the water before the fever could claim another. Scurvy, too, remained a slow and terrible companion for much of this era, though by Nelson's time the value of citrus was beginning to be understood by some captains and dismissed by others, and so its presence or absence aboard a given ship depended as much on the wisdom of command as on any universal practice. Men afflicted by scurvy suffered swollen gums, loosened teeth, wounds that would not close, an exhaustion that sank into the bones and would not lift, and though the remedy was simple when applied, the understanding of why it worked remained years away, leaving many crews to suffer needlessly under captains who trusted tradition over the mounting evidence of lemon juice and fresh vegetables. Rigging accidents claimed their own steady toll separate from the violence of battle or the treachery of weather. A man aloft, adjusting sail in conditions that seemed calm enough, might lose his footing on a yard slick with morning dew, might reach for a line that gave way at the worst possible moment, might simply misjudge a distance in the darkness of a night watch and fall the great height to the deck below, or worse, into the sea itself, where the ship, moving under its own momentum, could not always turn back in time to save him. These falls were common enough that every sailor aboard understood the risk each time he climbed into the rigging, understood that the discipline of careful movement, of testing each foothold before trusting his weight to it, was not merely instruction but survival. Still the falls happened, season after season. An accepted cost of maintaining the great cloth wings that carried the vessel forward. When death came, whether from injury or fever, or the simple accumulated wear of a hard life at sea, the ship observed it with a solemnity that stood in quiet contrast to the roughness of daily existence aboard. The body was prepared by the deceased man's messmates, sewn into his own hammock, weighted at the feet with shot or stone so that it would sink and not rise again to trouble the ship's wake. A final act of care performed by men who had shared his bread and his watches, and now performed this last service without complaint, however grim the task. The sailmaker, by long custom, made the final stitch through the canvas near the nose, a practice whose origin no one could quite explain, but which every crew observed. Some saying it was done to be certain the man was truly gone before he was given to the water, and there was a grim comfort in the ritual's persistence, however uncertain its reasoning. The burial itself took place with the entire crew, or as many as could be spared from duty, gathered on deck in whatever weather the day provided. The captain or chaplain reading the burial service in a voice that carried across the assembled men and out over the water the same ancient words spoken for admirals and for powder monkeys alike. For this was one of the few moments aboard ship where rank dissolved into the shared fact of mortality. The body, resting on a plank at the rail, was tipped at the words, "committing it to the deep," and it slipped away with scarcely a sound, swallowed by water that showed no sign it had received anything at all. No ripple lasting more than a moment. No mark left upon the surface to indicate that a life, however humble. The ship sailed on. It always sailed on. There was no harbour to pause in, no church bell to toll the hour of loss, only the wind filling the sails as it had before, and the watch changing at its appointed time, and the sea closing over what it had been given without comment or ceremony beyond what the living had already offered. Among the surviving records of this era, the logs kept by ship surgeons offer a particular kind of testimony, sparse and factual on their surface, yet carrying, beneath the clinical language, the weight of what these men witness daily. One such log, kept aboard a ship of the line during the years of blockade duty off the French coast, records in careful hand the treatment of a topman who fell from the mizzen-top during a night exercise, noting the nature of the injury, the procedure undertaken, the quantity of spirits administered. A single line noting that the patient had died in the night, the fever having taken hold despite every effort. There is no embellishment in these entries, no indulgence in grief or frustration, only the steady record of a man doing his work as best his knowledge allowed, documenting outcomes both fortunate and otherwise with the same even hand, because the log was official record and not confession, and yet reading it now, across the distance of centuries, one senses in its very restraint the depth of what it does not say. The hours spent at that narrow table, the sounds that filled that cramped berth below the waterline, the quiet courage required simply to continue the work each time a new patient was carried down the ladder, and that the surgeon's task was not to guarantee survival, but only to offer whatever skill and mercy the age allowed, and then to record the result plainly and turn to whatever came next. There was, in the hours before an engagement, a particular quality to the silence aboard a ship of the line, not the silence of emptiness, for the vessel had never held more purposeful movement, but the silence of men who had stopped speaking because speech had become unnecessary, because every hand aboard had rehearsed this sequence so many times in drill that the body now moved ahead of the mind, and the mind was left only to watch and to wait, and to notice small things with unusual clarity. The color of the light on the water that morning, the particular creak of a familiar timber. Seen perhaps for the first time, truly seen, though you had shared a mess with him for 2 years. The drums beat to quarters, and the sound of them traveled through the wooden hull in a way that could not be mistaken for anything else, a rapid, insistent rhythm that reached every deck and every man, whether he was asleep in a hammock or elbow deep in the galley or high aloft trimming a sail. And at that sound, the ship seemed to change its nature entirely, transforming in a matter of minutes from a floating village, with its routines of mending and cooking and idle talk, into an instrument built for a single purpose. Hammocks were struck and carried to the rails, where they were stowed tightly as a form of makeshift armor against splinters and shot. The partitions that had divided the wardroom and the officers' cabins, the thin wooden walls that gave the illusion of privacy in a vessel where privacy was already scarce, were unshipped and stowed below, so that the gun deck ran the length of the ship unbroken, a single long chamber given over entirely to the guns. Furniture that had no place in battle was struck down into the hold. The captain's own table, his chairs, his modest comforts, vanished into storage as readily as anything belonging to the lowest hand, for the ship in battle recognized no rank in its geometry. Every deck became gun deck, every space became a place of work, The gun crews took their positions with the particular calm of men who had done this before, in drill if not in earnest, and the ritual of preparation unfolded with a discipline that might have looked, to an untrained eye, almost peaceful. The sponges wetted, the rammers laid ready. The powder cartridges brought up from the magazine below the waterline by the boys who served that duty, boys of 10 or 11 or 12, small enough to move quickly through the ship's narrow passages, entrusted with carrying the ship's most volatile cargo in wooden boxes lined with leather. Running the same path again and again for as long as the guns required feeding, and it was this duty, more than any other aboard, that had earned them the name by which history would remember them. Powder monkeys, small and quick and essential, moving through smoke and noise that would have frozen a grown man, because they had been trained to it, because the ship's survival depended on the unbroken rhythm of their passage from magazine to gun and back again. Each gun, once run out through its port, became the responsibility of a crew of 6 or 8 or more, depending on its size, and each man within that crew held a single function that he performed with a mechanical exactness bred of endless practice, the sponger driving the wetted sponge down the barrel to extinguish any lingering spark from the previous discharge, the loader ramming home the cartridge and then the shot, the second captain pricking the cartridge through the touch hole and inserting the quill tube that would carry the flame, and the gun captain himself standing slightly back, lanyard in hand, watching the roll of the ship, waiting for the precise moment when the barrel's aim would align with the enemy hull as the two vessels rose and fell on the swell. For firing at the wrong instant sent a shot uselessly into the sky or wastefully into the sea, and firing at the right one could open a hole in an enemy's side that no carpenter could close before the battle ended. Choreography of the broadside once begun took on a rhythm of its own, the run-out, the aim, the fire, the recoil that sent the gun careening backward on its tackles with a violence that could crush a man's foot or worse if he stood carelessly in its path, and then immediately the sponging, the reloading, the running out again, over and over. A cycle that might repeat itself 20 or 30 times or more within a single engagement. Each repetition performed inside a fog of black powder smoke that grew thicker with every discharge until the gun deck became a place where a man could see, perhaps, the width of his own gun crew and little else. Where the world had narrowed to the faces immediately beside him, lit intermittently by muzzle flash, streaked with sweat and grime, mouths open sometimes in shouted commands that could scarcely be heard over the roar, the entire deck given over to a controlled chaos that from any distance might have seemed indistinguishable from disorder itself, but which was, in truth, one of the most rigorously disciplined performances that any group of men aboard that ship would ever undertake, for chaos without discipline killed the crew as surely as any enemy shot, and it was discipline alone drilled into muscle and bone across years of practice. That allowed men to load and fire and reload inside a deafening enclosure of smoke and thunder without the entire enterprise collapsing into panic. It is Trafalgar that history has fixed upon as the emblem of this experience, and rightly so, for in the logbooks and letters and later testimonies of the men who fought there, one finds every element of the naval engagement rendered with unusual clarity, the approach itself slow and almost unbearable. As Nelson's ships bore down upon the combined fleet under full sail, exposed to raking fire for the better part of an hour before they could bring their own guns to bear, a period that veterans would later describe as harder on the nerves than the battle itself. For a man standing at his post, forbidden to fire, watching the enemy's broadsides approach across the water, with nothing to occupy his hands or his mind, but the waiting endured a species of dread that action itself, once joined, tended to dissolve. And then the collision of fleets, the ships passing close enough that a man might see the faces of his enemies across the narrow gap of water, and the guns opening at last in a concentration of fire that witnesses described as producing a sound unlike any other experienced on land or sea. Not a series of distinct explosions, but a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to have no beginning and no end, that shook the timbers underfoot and pressed against the chest like a physical weight that rendered ordinary hearing impossible for hours afterward and left many gunners partially deafened for the remainder of their lives. Inside that thunder, men fought a battle that was in some sense entirely private, for each gun crew, sealed within its own pocket of smoke and noise, could know little of how the wider engagement was proceeding, whether the ship ahead had struck her colours, whether the mast overhead still stood. And it was this narrowing of awareness, this reduction of the vast strategic contest to the small and immediate business of one's own gun, that many survivors would later identify as the defining psychological feature of the experience. A controlled terror that left no room for wider fear, because there was no space left in the mind for anything beyond the next action, the next command, the next repetition of the drilled sequence that had become, in that hour, indistinguishable from instinct itself. Nelson fell that day, struck by a musket ball fired from the rigging of a French ship, and was carried below to the same cockpit where the wounded of his own crew were already gathering. And there, amid the same lantern light and the same crowded press of suffering men that attended any battle's aftermath, he lingered through the hours of the engagement's conclusion, receiving reports of the victory as it unfolded above him, and died knowing that the fleet he had led had triumphed, though the cost of that triumph in his own life, and in the lives of many hundreds of men aboard both fleets, was already being counted in the surgeons' lists and the pursers' books, even as the guns fell silent and the smoke began at last to drift and clear from decks that had for hours known nothing but thunder. For the ordinary sailor, no less than for the admiral, battle was an experience that resisted easy telling afterward, not because it could not be described, but because description seemed always to fall short of the thing itself, the ringing in the ears that persisted for days, the strange quiet that followed the gun's silence, a quiet that felt almost unnatural after hours. Inside that continuous roar and the slow return of ordinary senses, ordinary thought, as men who had given themselves over entirely to the drilled rhythm of the broadside found themselves once more standing amid wreckage and stillness, blinking in daylight that seemed for a moment unfamiliar. As though the world itself required a moment to remember its former shape before the business of counting the cost of the ship, of the fleet, of the men who would not answer the muster that evening could properly begin. The quiet did not arrive all at once. It came in layers the way the tide comes in over a long flat shore, each wave reaching a little farther than the last, until the whole business of sound had changed its character entirely. First, the guns fell silent, one by one, as captains of each piece looked to their lieutenants and received the word to cease. Then the shouting eased, the orders that had been necessary to be heard over the roar no longer needing to carry so far, so that men found themselves speaking in ordinary voices to ears that still rang with the memory of thunder. And then, last of all, came the silence beneath the silence, the absence of the thing that had filled every man's chest for hours, the concussion that had beaten against ribs and skull, until it seemed less a sound than a condition of being alive. When that too receded, what remained felt almost indecent in its stillness, as though the ship herself did not know what to do with so much quiet after so much violence. Men moved through this new quiet, slowly the way one moves through a house, after waking from a fever, uncertain whether the legs will hold, uncertain whether the eyes can be trusted. The gun deck was a wreck of its own particular kind. Not the splintered ruin of the enemy's hull, though there was that too in places where a ball had found its mark, but a wreck of ordinary things disordered by hours of labor. Ropes lay where they had been dropped. Powder monkeys sat where they had last set down their cartridges, some of them asleep sitting upright, boys of 10 and 11 whose bodies had simply stopped once the demand upon them ceased. Sponges and rammers lay across the deck like fallen tools in an abandoned workshop, and through all of it moved the surgeon's mates and the boatswain's party and the men detailed to carry the wounded below, their voices low, their movements unhurried now, in a way that must have felt strange after the frantic pace of the action itself, as though the body, having spent its store of urgency, could not summon more even for grief. The wounded were gathered first, always first, carried on gratings and improvised litters down through the hatchways to where the surgeon waited among his instruments and his buckets, the orlop deck already thick with the smell of blood and rum and the tallow of the lanterns burning low in that windowless space below the waterline. A man's arm, shattered by langrage, another blinded by a splinter no larger than a finger, a boy whose leg had been taken clean off below the knee, and who was, by the accounts that survive, remarkably calm about it, asking only whether his mates had come through the action well before he would consent to be laid upon the table. The surgeon and his assistants worked through the hours that followed with a speed that seems, from the distance of centuries, almost brutal in its necessity. No time for gentleness, only for competence. The tourniquet applied, the saw employed, the wound dressed, and the man moved aside to make room for the next and the next, until the pile of shattered limbs beneath the table had grown to a height that the assistants would spend the following morning carrying up and casting into the sea. Above, on the gun deck and the quarterdeck, the dead were gathered separately, laid in rows with whatever covering could be found, and here too the counting had its own peculiar quiet. The muster book brought out, names read aloud, and beside each name a pause where an answering voice should have come. This was, by every account that has survived, one of the hardest moments of the whole engagement, harder in its way than the battle itself, because the battle had at least the mercy of motion, of purpose, of not having time to feel the weight of what was happening. The muster had no such mercy. It required a man to stand still and listen to the absence of his friend's voice, and to know that the absence was now permanent, and to say nothing, because there was nothing to be said that the ship's routine allowed for. Not yet. Not until the burials that would come at dusk or the following morning. Weighted and stitched into their own hammocks, and given to the sea with what brief and formal words the chaplain or the captain could offer. Between these two extremities of care, the frantic labour over the wounded, the grim ceremony of counting the dead, there stretched the ordinary and enormous work of restoring the ship herself to something like order. The decks, slick with blood and blackened with powder residue, were washed down with seawater hauled up in buckets, holystones dragged across the planking, not for the usual purpose of appearance, but for the plainer necessity of footing, so that men would not slip in what remained. Rigging cut away in the action was cleared and, where possible, spliced back into service. Shot holes in the hull were plugged, sometimes with nothing more elaborate than a shirt or a hammock stuffed into the gap and braced from within until the carpenter's party could make a more lasting repair. And through all of this labour, men worked alongside one another with a particular quality of silence that those who have written of it struggled, later, to properly describe. Not the silence of exhaustion alone, though that was present, but a silence that seemed to hold within it everything that had just occurred. Done had spoken because it could not yet be spoken, because the ordinary words available to men were insufficient to the size of what they had lived through together. It is in the letters and journals that survive from this period that we find the truest record of what followed a battle's end. And what strikes the reader across the distance of more than 2 centuries is how consistently these accounts hold relief and grief, as though the two could not be separated even in memory. A lieutenant writing to his sister some days after an engagement might describe, in careful and measured hand, his gratitude at having survived, his relief at finding his particular friends unharmed, and in the very next line, record the loss of a messmate with whom he had shared a berth for 3 years. A man whose habits and jokes and small kindnesses he had come to depend upon without ever quite noticing the dependence until it was gone. There is, in these letters, little of the heroic register that popular imagination might expect. There is instead a plain and often halting attempt to record what had happened, written by men who seem aware that no one at home could truly understand it, and who wrote anyway, because the writing was itself a kind of tending. What emerges most clearly from these accounts, and what deserves particular attention here, is the quality of camaraderie that battle forged among men who depended upon one another with an intimacy that shore-bound life rarely demands. The gun crews of Nelson's navy trained together for months, sometimes years, each man's task interlocking with his neighbor's, in a pattern so practiced it became instinct. The sponger, the loader, the man at the tackle, each dependent on the other's timing. Each aware that a single failure of nerve or competence might cost not only his own life, but the lives of every man at that gun. This dependency, forged first in drill and then tested in the fire of actual engagement, produced a bond that the men themselves often struggled to name, but which appears again and again in their writing as something close to brotherhood, a tenderness made strange and deep by the violence in which it had been proven. One account that has survived, and which deserves to be quoted here in something close to its original form, comes from a gunner's mate who served aboard a ship of the line during this period, and who kept, against regulation and against likelihood, a small private journal in which he recorded not the tactics of the engagement, but its human residue. Writing of the evening, following an action in which his gun crew had lost 2 of its 8 men, he set down these words: that he had gone to his hammock that night, expecting sleep to come easily, given the exhaustion of the day, but had instead lain awake, listening to the ship's ordinary sounds, the creak of her timbers, the slap of water against the hull, and had found himself, in his own words, more grieved by the quiet than he had been frightened by the noise that preceded it. He wrote that he missed already the particular way one of his lost mates had of humming some half-remembered tune while running out the gun, a habit that had annoyed him for the better part of a year and which he would now, he wrote, give a great deal to hear again. He wrote, too, of relief, plain, unashamed relief at having himself survived, and noted with what he called a sailor's honesty that this relief and this grief seemed to occupy the same space within him, without any contradiction he could identify, as though the heart, unlike the ledger, had no need to keep such things separate. This capacity to hold both feelings at once, without the demand that one resolve the other, seems to have been characteristic of the men who lived through these engagements and left some record of the living. They did not, on the whole, write of glory in any simple sense. They wrote of their mates, named and specific, remembered in small and ordinary detail, a habit, a joke, a kindness, done in some unremarkable moment before the guns began. They wrote of the strange tenderness that violence, paradoxically, had deepened between them, a tenderness that had no easy equivalent in the life most of them had left behind on shore. And they wrote, when they wrote, at all of the larger meaning of what they had endured, with a plainness that seems from this distance its own kind of eloquence, men who had been asked to do something enormous, and who had done it, and who now, in the quiet that followed, into whatever calm the sea might grant them before the next demand came. Land, when it finally came, arrived first as a smell rather than a sight. Men who had spent months or years breathing nothing but salt and tar and the close stink of the lower decks would catch, on some morning watch, a change in the air, the faint green mineral scent of soil, of trees, of something growing that was not seaweed or ship's biscuit gone soft with weevils. Long before the lookout called land, the older hands would lift their heads and sniff the way animals do, and something in their shoulders would ease, though none of them could have said exactly why it was not yet home. It was, most often, not even England, but some intermediate anchorage, some victualling port, where the ship might take on water and stores before continuing to wherever the war required her next. But it was land, and after enough months at sea, land itself became a kind of promise, even when it promised nothing in particular. The ship's actual return to her home port, when it came, after a long commission, was a slower and stranger thing than the word homecoming suggests. There was no single moment of arrival that swept everything before it. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of signs. The color of the water changing as it shallowed, the increase of other sails on the horizon, the gulls arriving in numbers that meant a coastline was near, then the coastline itself. And grey and utterly familiar in shape to men who had drawn it from memory in their minds 1,000 times during the months away. Portsmouth or Plymouth or the Nore would rise out of the haze looking exactly as it had looked when they left. And this exactness was itself disorienting, because the men doing the looking were not remotely the same as when they had departed. A boy of 16 who had gone out on his first commission might return 3 years later as someone who had seen battle, who had held a dying friend, who had learned to read a sky for storms and could splice a rope in the dark by feel alone, and the harbour into which he sailed had not moved an inch to acknowledge any of it. The stone of the docks, the particular slant of a church spire above the town, the same taverns with the same signs swinging, all of it sat there patiently, indifferent as though no time had passed at all. And this indifference of place to the changes in the men who returned to it was one of the quieter cruelties of the sailor's life, one that no flogging or storm had prepared them for. The disorientation, when they finally set foot on the solid ground of the dockside, was often described, in the rare accounts that describe it at all, as a physical, bodily confusion rather than merely an emotional one. The legs of a man who had spent years compensating for the roll and pitch of a deck did not know at first how to walk on ground that did not move. Sailors newly landed were known to stagger as though drunk before they had touched a drop, their inner ear and their long-trained muscles still braced for a swell that was no longer there, and it might take days for the land to stop feeling, faintly, as though it were still gently heaving beneath them. Some described it almost with embarrassment, this involuntary rolling gait that marked them instantly as men of the sea even before anyone noticed their weathered hands or their tarred trousers. It was as though the body itself needed a period of reacquaintance with the fixed and solid world, just as the mind needed time to remember how to want things beyond survival, a meal that was not salted, a bed that did not swing. For most sailors, though, the deeper uncertainty of landfall was not physical but financial, and it began almost as soon as they set foot ashore, if not before. Wages in the Navy of this period were paid irregularly and often far in arrears. A man might be owed a year or more of pay by the time his ship finally paid off, and the settling of these accounts was a bureaucratic process that could stretch on for weeks, during which he had in practice no money at all beyond whatever he had managed to save or win at cards or borrow against his eventual pay. Prize money, the fabled reward for captured enemy vessels, loomed large in the imagination of every sailor and delivered in practice wildly unevenly. A lucky ship that had taken a rich prize might see her captain grow wealthy beyond anything his naval salary alone could provide, while the ordinary seaman below him received a share that, after the deductions of agents and the long delays of legal process, might amount to only a few pounds. Welcome, certainly, but rarely the transforming windfall that the stories back in the forecastle had promised. Many men waited years for prize money that was legitimately owed to them, chasing it through agents and courts that seemed designed, whether by neglect or by intention, to exhaust a sailor's patience before it exhausted his claim. Some received nothing at all, the paperwork lost, the prize agent vanished or bankrupt, the whole promised sum dissolving into the same fog that had swallowed so much else of their service. For those who had been wounded or worn out in the king's service, there existed the theoretical provision of a pension, administered through Greenwich Hospital, or through smaller outpensions that might be paid to a man living in his own home rather than within the hospital's walls. These pensions, when they came, were rarely generous, and the process of qualifying for one required a man to prove his service, and his injury to the satisfaction of officials who had never stood on a heaving deck in their lives. Sailor missing an arm or a leg, invalided out after some engagement that had cost him dearly, might spend months navigating the paperwork of his own ruin, presenting himself before boards and clerks who assessed his worth in pounds and shillings against a body that no longer functioned as it had. Those who succeeded might receive a modest sum, enough perhaps to keep a small room and eat plainly, but rarely enough to reconstruct a life. Those who failed, or who simply lacked the literacy or the patience or the luck to navigate the system, often ended in poverty that the nation whose wars had cost them their limbs seemed in no great hurry to address. The figure of the disabled old sailor, begging in the streets of a port town or singing for coins with a wooden leg, and a story of Trafalgar or the Nile, was common enough in this period to become almost a stock image, a symbol of service rewarded chiefly with neglect, though it should be said that this image, however true in many cases, does not capture the full range of outcomes, for some men did secure their pensions, did find their prize money, did manage some modest stability after their service, even if the records that would let us know how many is a proportion history has never been able to fully recover. Beyond the money or its absence, there was the matter of what a discharged sailor was meant to do with the rest of his life. A question that the Navy, having consumed his years so thoroughly, offered little help in answering. Some returned to whatever trade they had followed before the press gang or their own choice had taken them to sea, picking up tools they had not held in years, finding the muscles for a different kind of work, strange and stiff after so long spent hauling rope and running rigging. Some drifted into the merchant service instead, unable to imagine a life entirely apart from the sea, despite everything it had cost them, men for whom the ocean had become less a place of employment than simply the only world they knew how to inhabit. Others, especially the young who had gone to sea as boys and grown to manhood there, found themselves oddly stranded on land, unequipped for any trade, unable to settle into the rhythms of a shore-based life that felt, after the intense compression of shipboard existence, somehow too slow and too empty of purpose. It was not uncommon for men to re-enlist after only a short time ashore, driven back to the Navy not by love of it, but by the simple absence of anywhere else to go, the sea having become, against all its cruelties, the only place that would still have them. And then there were the families, waiting or not waiting, changed or unchanged, in ways the war had never consulted them about. A wife who had married a young man and then not seen him for 3 or 5 years might open her door to someone both familiar and strange. A husband aged beyond his years, carrying scars she had not put there and memories she could not share. Often carried within it a quiet grief for the version of each other they had lost along the way. Children grew up not knowing their fathers at all, or knowing them only through the uncertain medium of letters that arrived irregularly, if they arrived at all, dictated often to a shipmate for men who could not write, full of careful sentiments and small requests for news of home. Some men returned to find their wives had died in their absence, or their children grown and gone, or their parents buried in a churchyard they had not been present to attend. The Navy's demands did not pause for grief on either side of the separation, and the reunions that did happen, genuinely happy ones, tender ones, the sort briefly mentioned in a few surviving letters with real warmth, existed alongside countless others where the years apart had simply worn away too much, leaving two people who loved each other in memory trying to recognize each other in fact. It is worth pausing here on how little of this we actually know in detail, and how much has had to be pieced together since from scattered and uneven sources. Most sailors of this era could not write or wrote only haltingly, and so the great majority of these homecomings, their disorientations, their financial struggles, their family reunions and ruptures, went entirely unrecorded, existing now only in the aggregate. Trent in the patterns historians can infer from muster books and pension records, and the occasional surviving letter, rather than in any direct testimony from the men themselves. The voices we do have, a literate boatswain's mate, a lieutenant's private diary, a widow's petition for her husband's unpaid wages, are precious precisely because they are so rare, small windows into an experience that was, for most who lived it, simply lived and then lost to time, unrecorded because no one thought to ask, and unrecorded because the men themselves, perhaps, did not think their own lives worth the ink. What we have reconstructed since is necessarily partial, built from fragments, and it leaves us always aware of how much silence surrounds even the most well-documented voyages, how many thousands of homecomings occurred in the same quiet, unremarked way, a man walking up from the docks into a town that had gone on without him. Dock carrying inside him a war that the town would never fully see or understand. The years moved on, as years do, indifferent to the ships that had carried them. The wooden world that had shaped a generation of sailors began, slowly, and then all at once, to give way to something else. Steam came first as a curiosity, a smudge of black smoke on the horizon that older sailors regarded with suspicion, and then as a certainty that could not be argued with. Canvas, which had carried fleets across every ocean for centuries, which had been mended and patched and blessed by chaplains and cursed by topmen in gales, began to seem impossibly fragile beside the tireless turning of a paddle wheel or a screw propeller. The men who had once read the wind in the set of a sail, who could tell a coming storm from the color of the water or the behavior of birds, watched engines do work that had once required 40 hands aloft and a captain's steady nerve. It was not a sudden death, it was a fading, the kind that happens so gradually that those living through it scarcely noticed the change until one day they look up and find the old world entirely gone. The ships themselves went the way of all wooden things left too long without purpose. Some were broken up in the yards where they had been built, their timbers sold for scrap, for furniture, for the beams of houses that would stand long after anyone had forgotten which vessel had given them shape. There is a strange, quiet poetry in this. A ship of the line, once the pride of a fleet, its ribs and planking now holding up the roof of a tavern or forming the floor of a chapel. The wood that had absorbed the concussion of broadsides and the salt of 1,000 storms, now absorbing nothing more dramatic than the footsteps of parishioners on a Sunday morning. Other ships simply rotted at their moorings, deemed no longer worth the expense of maintaining, their guns removed, their rigging stripped, until they became hulks used for storage, or as floating prisons, a slow and undignified end for vessels that had once carried men into the thunder of Trafalgar or the grey misery of a Baltic blockade. A few, a very few, were preserved, kept afloat through the devotion of those who understood that something irreplaceable was slipping away, that once the last of these ships were gone, the physical memory of that entire age would exist only in paper and paint. Nelson's own flagship survives even now, resting in dry dock, her hull repainted many times over, her decks walked by visitors who come with cameras rather than cutlasses, who read placards where sailors once stood barefoot and waiting. To walk her decks today is to feel something of what has been described in the hours before this: the low ceilings, the confined spaces, the impossible density of men who once lived and worked and died within her frame. But it is a different kind of knowing. The visitor feels the coolness of the wood, hears perhaps an echo of what it might have been, but does not feel the salt crust on the skin, does not smell the bilge water or the tallow candles, does not carry in the body the ache of a watch just ended and another just beginning. The ship remains faithfully rebuilt and maintained through generations of careful hands, but the life that filled her has gone, and what is left is a kind of reverent absence, a space shaped precisely to the dimensions of a world that no longer exists. What remains beyond the ships themselves is scattered and various, and taken together It forms the only bridge we have back to the men who served. There are the muster books, page after page of names in careful copperplate listing, rates and dates, and sometimes the brief, blunt notation of a death: drowned, killed in action, discharged, dead, words that stand in for entire lives about which we will otherwise never know anything at all. There are the logbooks, kept faithfully by officers whose duty it was to record wind and weather and the ship's position, and who sometimes, almost despite themselves, let slip a line of feeling amid the navigational data: a note about a man lost overboard in a gale, a mention of the strange quiet after an engagement, a small human observation tucked between latitude and longitude, as though the writer could not entirely suppress the person beneath the officer. There are the letters, fewer than we might wish, written by men who could write and who had someone waiting to receive their words. Letters that speak of homesickness and hope and the particular loneliness of a sailor's life, preserved sometimes by pure chance, tucked into a family Bible or folded into a drawer and forgotten until a descendant, generations later, found them and understood suddenly that a stranger's ordinary words had become a kind of inheritance. And there are the memorials, stone and brass, standing in churchyards and naval chapels and on monuments raised in ports that no longer bustle with the traffic of sail. Names etched in long columns, ranks, and ships noted beside them. The dates of battles that once filled newspapers and now exist mostly in textbooks. Walk along such a memorial slowly, as one might walk along the deck of a preserved ship, and the names begin to blur together. Hundreds of them, thousands in the larger monuments, each one representing a life as full and complicated and singular as any life lived today, each one reduced now to a name and a date, sometimes not even a full name. Sometimes only initials and a surname, the given name lost somewhere in the passage of records, from ship to shore, to archive, to stone. It is a strange kind of immortality, this. Permanent in the sense that the stone will likely outlast anything else connected to these men, and yet almost entirely empty of the particular truth of who they were, what they feared, what they loved, how they laughed with their messmates over a joke long since forgotten by everyone who ever knew it. This is perhaps the quiet meditation that the age of sail leaves us with. Not a grand lesson about heroism or empire, though those larger histories have their place and their scholars, but something smaller and more durable, a meditation on the dignity of ordinary endurance. Most of the men who served in Nelson's navy were not seeking glory. They were pressed, or they enlisted out of necessity, out of hunger, out of the simple absence of better options, and they found themselves living lives of extraordinary hardship inside vessels that asked everything of the body and offered very little in return beyond the bread and salt beef. When it arrived at all diminished by deductions and delays, and yet they did the work. They climbed the rigging in storms that would terrify anyone standing safely on shore. They stood their watches through the coldest hours of the night, half asleep on their feet, because the ship required it, and because the men beside them depended on it. They endured the surgeon's crude instruments without complaint, or with only the complaint that pain forces from any human body, and they returned, when they could, to duties that had not paused to accommodate their suffering. This was not heroism, in the way the word is often used, the singular dramatic act performed before an audience. It was something quieter and in its way more remarkable, a sustained, unglamorous endurance repeated day after day, year after year, by men whose names, for the most part, history has not troubled to remember. There is dignity in this that does not require the trumpet blast of commemoration to be true. A man who stood his watch faithfully through 100 ordinary nights, who never once distinguished himself in battle, who simply did the work asked of him and came home, if he came home at all, changed and quiet and unable to fully explain what he had lived through. That man's life carries a weight equal to any admiral's, even if the stone monuments and the history books have decided otherwise. The wooden world demanded everything of everyone who lived within it, officer and rating alike, and it did not ask whether the demand was fair. It simply made the demand, and men answered it, because that was the shape of the life they had been given, and because the alternative, desertion, mutiny, refusal, carried consequences that made simple endurance the more survivable choice. In this way, endurance itself becomes a kind of quiet heroism, unremarked and largely unremembered, but no less real for having gone unrecorded. Picture now, a harbour at dusk, not the harbour of departure with which this story began, full of activity and dread, and the particular tension of men not yet knowing what lay ahead, but a harbour much later, after the age itself has passed. The masts that once crowded the anchorage are gone, or reduced to the few preserved vessels kept as monuments to what used to be ordinary. The light falls low and gold across water that has seen everything and reveals nothing, indifferent as it has always been to the ships that crossed it and the men who did not return. Somewhere along the waterfront, a preserved ship sits at her moorings, rigging rising black and empty against a darkening sky, no sailors aloft, no watch being called, only the quiet creak of old timber settling into the evening, the way it has settled into 10,000 evenings before, patient, waiting for nothing in particular. Holding within her boards the compressed memory of a world that has otherwise entirely disappeared. The gulls call as they have always called, the tide moves as it has always moved. And somewhere beneath all of it, unrecorded and unrecoverable, rest the ordinary lives of the men who served, who endured, who came home, changed or did not come home at all, their names perhaps on a stone somewhere, perhaps nowhere, their stories folded quietly into the larger silence of the sea. If you have found some rest in this history, there are more quiet voyages waiting whenever you wish to return to them. Sleep well and let the tide carry you gently until then.